Hello and welcome to Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Juliano Fiori. From rising geopolitical tensions to the worsening climate situation, and from the Gaza genocide to hot wars that threaten to spill into great power conflict, the world of the 2020s is one of concatenating crises. But is our moment, to use the term popularized by Antonio Gramsci, an interregnum that will be followed by a new moment of relatively ordered hegemony, with China perhaps playing the role of the new global hegemon? My guest today argues otherwise. Juliano is the director of the Alameda Institute, which is currently running a research project titled After Order that makes the case that we have entered a post-order situation in which crisis is the new normal. In our conversation today, we talked about why Juliano believes the creation of a relatively stable new international order is unlikely, and why China will probably not be able to assume a position of international leadership on the scale needed to create such a situation. We also talked about Gramsci's concept of the interregnum, how disordering at the international level is mirrored and mutually constituted by the disordering of national polities and the world of work. And we also talked about the extent to which the pre-Donald Trump era really was a rules-based system, given the extreme violence that the United States and its allies have been the authors of since World War II. If you find this interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content, such as the recent Listeners' Questions episode with Daniel Trilling. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. Juliano Fiori is the director of the Alameda Institute. His current research addresses the political economy of crisis and the imagination of catastrophe. His writing on politics and culture is published regularly in Brazil, where he lives, in Britain, where he grew up, and beyond. So Juliano, at the Alameda Institute, you're currently running a project called After Order. And on the Alameda website, the premise of the project is partially defined in the following terms: questioning the assumption that we are now in an interregnum, a temporary period between stable orders. Alameda's After Order research project considers the possibility that we have entered a time of more frequent crisis, a time after stable orders. In a moment, we'll perhaps get into why you dispute the applicability of Antonio Gramsci's idea of the interregnum to the global situation in 2026. Something that's, perhaps a little bit amusing in the context of this podcast, of course, because interregnum is the name we adopted for the series of interviews that I do with Richard Seymour. But before we talk about interregnum, it might be useful to define terms a little bit. So, of course, the idea of living after order, it raises a whole bunch of immediate questions, including whether it makes sense to use the term order at all to describe the post-war era. And then there's the question of periodization, when exactly the moment characterized by this US superintended order began, and when did it fray and start to fall apart? Now, on the left, there has been, a quite understandable, I think, reluctance to accept uncritically the notion of the idea of order, particularly when it comes to what's been termed the rules-based order. That's partly because through the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st, the United States and its allies routinely violated international law and supported, many murderous authoritarian regimes, most notoriously the apartheid regimes in South Africa and Israel, but of course not limited to them. But also because however ordered life might have felt for sections of the populations of the states of the global north, and even then only sections of those populations and perhaps only at certain times, the sense that there was order was obviously something that was less manifest in zones of conflict and areas that were subject to sort of heightened imperial predation. You could sort of even stretch that further and say that the world was already disordered and that disorder just wasn't very evenly distributed. So first, can you say a bit about what order under American hegemony consisted of in your view, and how your understanding of order perhaps diverges from a more typically liberal idea of the rules-based order and its supposed norms?
So I'd start by agreeing to some extent with the conventional left and anti-imperialist critique of the concept of order as it's applied to international affairs. That is, to say the least, international order has been deployed as a concept euphemism and as euphemism for an imperial situation. There's certainly been an uneven distribution of order, as you've pointed out, an uneven distribution of disorder. And wherever there have been elements of order that have been felt by particular populations in particular moments of US hegemony, that's been at very best partial and at the expense of the disorder around it, around those particular moments. So I can understand very much the critique of the concept. And I think we can see the power of that euphemism waning in recent times, not least in the laments of liberals. In fact, the growing liberal lamentography, the books and journal articles and op-eds that have been written over the last decade and a half or so, which all seem to have a desire, not very secretly embedded in them, for some kind of restoration. And we can see that as well in the way that they're often used to project an intent to try to reproduce some kind of order. And that might involve a critique, a subtle critique or a soft critique of what came before, but it will always be trying to bring through certain residues of international order that came before. So I think to start with, recognizing in those liberal laments for the imperial situation that seems to be challenged at the moment, that order is itself a product of the imagination of liberals, but it's also a product of the imagination of critics of those same liberals. So it's a kind of dynamic normative construction that has been used, mobilized to create institutions, to reproduce hierarchies, to exercise different kinds of authority. To the extent that there is this process of normative projection that is aimed at reproducing power and reproducing hegemony, I think we should understand it as part of a process of ordering and continuous ordering. But that continuous ordering doesn't function primarily at the level of ideology. And I wouldn't want to focus too much on ideology and stating what I understand order to be. So really, I would go more to the material reality that produces a kind of hegemonic situation. You started off by talking about Gramsci's concept of interregnum. I think Gramsci's concept of hegemony is very useful. And that's actually how I engage with the concept of order here. So it's an understanding that every order is a hegemonic order, and that it depends not just on kinds of coercion, but also on the production of spontaneous consent. And if that's the case, there certainly was a period through the 20th century. Now you can debate which period that was, when it started, and also maybe when it's come to a conclusion. A period in which there was a sufficient international consent for US empire and some of its mechanisms of reproduction. What I would say is that period has now come to an end because it was sustained by a set of material conditions that no longer exist. And it wasn't only reflected in those material conditions, so the creation of an unparalleled industrial base and then a military industrial complex and projection of economic power, etc., but also through ideology and also through normative endeavors.
On the question of periodization and when that era of order came to an end, I imagine that most people would point to the beginning of the first Trump presidency. Although even then we saw that elements of the American establishment, part of the sort of, ancien regime, were able to push back and moderate the radicalism of the administration in that first term somewhat. But it's been argued by others that US hegemony really started to fall apart much earlier, specifically during George W. Bush's presidency, and particularly with the launch of the Iraq War, which, elicited strikingly little international support, including amongst key US allies, including France. And that conflict seemed to indicate a shift towards dominance rather than hegemony, right? With pure violence playing a greater role than is supposed to be the case under truly hegemonic conditions, where, sure, there's violence, but there's also a great deal more domestic and international consent. And symptomatically, it's also during that period of time that discussion of the United States as an empire became much more common, both on the left, but also amongst figures on the right who supported the US, who either unapologetically embraced the term, or if they didn't, they cast their project in very similar terms, even if they shied away from the word empire itself. I'm thinking in particular of the people around the Project for a New American Century who talked a lot about primacy, which seemed more or less to stand in for empire. So what's your view on where to date the breakdown of order? Where do the material conditions start to fall apart and make US hegemony no longer viable as a long-term prospect? And do you see the Bush presidency and the war on terror as a sort of hinge point when it comes to the question of periodization?
It's a really tricky question, Alex. I think it's actually much trickier for us to identify a potential endpoint to US hegemony than it is for us to identify a starting point, not least because the endpoint might well not have come yet. I think it probably has, but it might be the case that we're in a sort of end time of US hegemony, and in fact there is still an ongoing unraveling or an ongoing collapse. And there are different indicators of what hegemony might require. So looking at the ways in which there's an adherence to certain kinds of institutions created or at least dominated by the US, the way in which ideas, norms, ideology of US empire are reproduced, the way in which there's adherence to dollar dominance, for example. So I think you can look at these different factors, but you should also look at the relationship between coercion and consent, most primarily when discussing hegemony on the terms that I've suggested. And it's no good just saying, look, Donald Trump is now bombing Iran and he's captured the president of Venezuela and he's bombing this country and bombing that country, because of course there were the forever wars under Obama and before, and the US has been at war consistently throughout its period of hegemony. So it's not the fact of
and that concept of the US as a rogue state is in some ways not a new one, right? It was just something that was more confined to the political left.
Exactly. It was more confined, but I do find it interesting that the way that term, actually, in fact, the way that the term interregnum has also been adopted right now by people from across the political spectrum, is itself perhaps an indication of a waning of consent, or recognition that there's a waning of consent. So it's not so much the exercise of that violent force. It's its relationship to different kinds of consent that might be reflected in institutions and in different kinds of adherence to US empire. And I'd say also in the way in which US empire requires pretext. And it seems very clear to me that over the last year, if not slightly longer than that, there's been very little interest in producing any kind of coherent pretext for the violence and the coercion exercised by US empire. So I would say certainly we can look to a current situation, the last couple of years, this Trump administration in particular, and say it's quite clear to me at least that US hegemony has collapsed or is collapsing.
Also, I suppose the extremity of the current situation also seems to be indicated by the way in which even US allies appear to be, in a very sort of half-hearted manner. This is not something they want to do, but they are starting to consider what the world looks like and what their position is if the US does cease to play the hegemonic role. I mean, the comments of Mark Carney are sort of most symptomatic in that case, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think they were certainly comments that generated a lot of attention because they came from a Western leader. But in fact, you see one of the principal paradoxes of relative imperial decline. And I should emphasize the word relative there, because I'm not suggesting that there's any kind of total imperial collapse. In fact, to some extent, there's a recrudescence of US empire in this particular moment, a kind of consolidation, different aspects of it, and an adaptation of US empire to new conditions. But that paradox is that it needs to take certain actions to suppress challenges that then end up generating new challenges. And we can just look at the war on Iran as an example, but also, in fact, the treatment of Russia, sanctions, the way in which there's an adaptation to sanctions regimes, which end up ultimately undermining some of the power or the extent of the power of US empire. Going back to your question on periodization, I think we can see indicators of collapsing US hegemony long before this period. Certainly at the turn of the millennium, I'd say the intervention in Kosovo was a key moment. That's when the US uses NATO as a surrogate for the UN, no longer able to do the same kind of generation of consent within the UN structures. It mobilized NATO to conduct that intervention. And then the war on terror. The war on terror was identified in particular by Giovanni Arrighi as a moment of unraveling US hegemony. In fact, there are a couple of long essays that Arrighi published in the New Left Review in 2005 under the title Hegemony Unraveling, in which he states that already there was a collapse of US hegemony, and he uses the concept by Indian historian Ranajit Guha, that dominance without hegemony. And I think there was a certain degree of foresight in identifying that moment as the beginning of the end, even if I think it was slightly anticipating the end. There were exercises in reproducing hegemony that I think were still important, even if they themselves also reflected a kind of exhaustion of some of the system of consent. So, for example, the intervention in Libya. Many saw that as a great victory for human rights and protection of civilian populations against mass atrocities. And at the same time, the way in which that intervention was conducted itself seemed to demonstrate that it was the last gasp of that particular trend of interventionism. And even going back before those indicators at the turn of the millennium, the first 10 years of the 21st century, there's been discussion of the end or the collapse of US hegemony for decades. I mean, in the 1970s and 1980s, international relations theorists of hegemony suggested that the US hegemonic situation was coming to an end.
And this, I mean, the context for that is partly the industrial revival of the former Axis powers, right? It's Germany and Japan in particular on the rise, along with France, for instance, but primarily those two states.
Yeah, and well, there's that statement that became quite famous at the end of the Cold War, and it wasn't just one person. Numerous people sort of reproduced this idea that the winners of the Cold War, in fact, Japan and Germany. Emmanuel Wallerstein, who also predicted the end of US hegemony, suggested that it was the rise of other powers, in particular in Asia, and was pointing to Japan at the time. This is in the 1990s, but also Germany. Going back to Arrighi, his foresight on these things, he did talk about waning US power in the 1990s, and he also focused on Japan initially, and then sort of adapted to the rise of China.
Something Donald Trump has sort of done, if one looks at his rhetoric, the rhetoric
totally.
around Japan from the 1980s is sort of identical to the rhetoric around China. It's just he's shifted the target.
Except that, totally. He said that because Trump obviously holds on to resentment in a particular way, it seems that he still took some joy in attacking Japan in recent times, at least rhetorically. It seems sort of residue of that moment. But I think something that Arrighi did recognize that's important is the way in which a sense of decline also mobilizes an attempt at recovery or restoration. In fact, there's an interesting essay that was part of an excellent first issue of Phenomenal World on American power, but the essay was by Tim Barker that discusses declinism and how it's being mobilized, to reproduce and adapt American empire.
Just going back to Gramsci and the concept of the Interregnum, as I mentioned in my first question, a core part of Alameda's After Order project is this idea that the Interregnum does not apply to our current situation. Could you expand on why you don't think it's a useful term in our context, and what its deployment you think implicitly gets wrong about the world of the early 2020s?
Sure. And no offense intended, given of course that you guys have used that concept. I wouldn't say it's irrelevant to the current moment. I'll explain how we're challenging the deployment of that concept. in particular in relation to what we might call international order, what has been called international order, and what's been conceptualized as such. So Gramsci's concept of interregnum, this period in which the old is dying and the new cannot be born or is struggling to be born. This period for Gramsci was produced by a loss of authority and a loss of kind of leadership. But I think it's evident in the way that this concept has now been used by people across the political spectrum, certainly not just by Gramscians, but those who have tried in some way to adapt Gramscian theory to international relations, and people who have probably never read Gramsci in their life, that there is something comforting about the interregnum, the concept of interregnum. That is, God, we're in this period of instability and ethical malaise, and we need to get back to some kind of stability. Obviously, we here is those who felt some kind of affinity for the previous order, those who always felt that there was disorder, that they were always oppressed, dominated through the imperial regimes and under capitalism previously, will probably not feel so comforted by the idea of a return of any kind of order. The mobilization of the concept seems to be providing a kind of reassurance a lot of the time. There are countless articles that are discussing right now and over the last few years that are discussing the possibility of building a new order. I think there was one by Danny Roderick and Stephen Walt that was entitled, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, was entitled How to Build a Better Order. And there's an implication there that orders are the product of the will. It's sort of a moral will that generates some kind of mobilization to build institutions, and those institutions themselves are the order. And that, in fact, that goes back to some extent, Mearsheimer's concept of international order as a grouping of institutions to govern interactions between states. Those are the epiphenomena for me. So it's not that just by getting powerful people together and establishing new institutions that might have adherents from a sufficient number of states or international organizations or fractions of capital, that will be enough to develop some kind of order on the other side.
Because to take that view would be to see something like, say, the decline of the British Empire as a problem of like policy, right? Like the British Empire collapsed because of bad decisions and inability to renew existing institutions or to create new ones. When regardless of what was done at that level, and okay, you can sort of manage your empire in more and less efficacious ways, and you can defer the collapse, but the collapse was always coming because the material basis just wasn't there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I chuckled in response to that because, of course, there is a line of historiography that focuses very much on the policy origins of imperial collapse, including the collapse of the British Empire. And I think that's a very superficial reading of history. Beyond the sense of reassurance that the concept of interregnum provides to certain people who mobilize it, there is a presumption there that either there is a possibility of creating the kind of material conditions that would sustain a system of consent, might be similar to the 20th century, or that there is even beyond that some kind of trans-historical process that generates recurrent cycles, and those cycles involve the establishment of a sufficient kind of hegemonic order. And here I go back to Arrighi. In fact, this is where I particularly take issue with his theorization of hegemonic transition and cycles of accumulation, because there is a kind of trans-historical sense to it. And it doesn't pay attention really to the singularity of what was US hegemony, a hegemony that was established at the global level. And of course, there in world systems theory in general, there's this idea of an expanding world system. And so once you get to the global scale, it necessarily needs to produce itself at that scale. And I suppose drawing on that premise, I would say that there was something exceptional about the period of US hegemony. It wasn't just another one of those cycles, not least because it involved a model of capitalist development that once it got to the outer limits, the global limits of a US-led capitalism, it had to find ways of introflecting, of turning back on itself and generating a kind of aggregate demand that wasn't about always expanding to new territories and to unexplored horizons. And so the idea that we would be going into a situation that is just the reproduction of a historical tendency towards a new kind of stability, I think that you see a tendency amongst theorists of international order to try to understand what are the key poles of power. And here there are plenty of people who are also taking a similar view, that we're not necessarily in a unipolar situation anymore, and that we might not be in a unipolar situation. And that is what would be required for there to be an order of the type that is referenced when people refer to international order today. So lots of discussion of multipolarity, whether that's analysts or whether that's states themselves, representatives of states. I mean, you can look here, I live in Brazil, you can look at somebody who was a very influential foreign minister in one of Lula's earlier administrations. Celso Amorim is now the senior advisor to Lula on foreign affairs, talking about multipolarity, not just as a tendency, but also as an objective. And then theorists like Sandro Mesadra and Brett Nielsen, who have talked about an open transition, not necessarily a kind of clear hegemonic transition to some kind of multipolarity. I think actually the discussion of poles is also sometimes a bit misleading, and it's more interesting to try to engage with what are the bases on which any kind of stable power might be developed. And just to finish on this point actually, because here's where I think it's more difficult to talk about interregnum in the international context. In national context, and there is obviously a relationship between what's going on within capitalist democracies in particular and the collapse of US hegemony. It seems to me like there's definitely a recurrence of hegemonic crisis. In fact, hegemonic crisis itself being a concept of Gramsci's, which I find much more useful in the current moment than interregnum itself. And there is a difficulty to get to the other side of those hegemonic crises and produce some kind of hegemonic order. We see that even just looking at sort of the fact that we've had many prime ministers in the UK over the last decade, but not just there. In France, there's it seems like an almost permanent inability now to produce some kind of class and political domination. In the US, there's similarities, and also on the periphery. So this reproduction of hegemonic crisis seems to indicate that at least it's difficult to get to the other side of interregnum. But within a closed society, albeit under an international system that's globalized, there is a much higher chance that you will get to some kind of class domination sooner or later. So I'm not saying that it's impossible that you'll ever have hegemonic orders again within the nation state, nor even would I be so bold as to say it's impossible in the international realm. I'm just saying it's very difficult at this stage to envisage the reproduction of the kind of exceptional situation that characterized US hegemony under, let's say, Chinese leadership.
We might come back to China and why you don't think China is a likely candidate to create something akin to the US-led order. But just to sort of, offer some kind of, partial defense of the idea of interregnum. One thought I had reading your work was that I wonder if part of the reason that the idea of the interregnum doesn't seem to meet the current moment actually has something to do with, not so much to do with Gramsci himself and how he formulated the idea, but more with the way Gramsci's ideas have been taken up, and particularly how they've been taken up in a domestic context. I'm thinking, of people like Stuart Hall, for instance, because one of the sort of, the key examples of the end of an interregnum and the creation of a new hegemony is the move from Fordism to post-Fordism and the neoliberal revolution of the late 70s and 1980s. And, of course, that has both an international and a domestic context. But that period, it was certainly a period of high drama and of great violence. But at least in the imperial core, it does seem to have been a sort of relatively managed process. And perhaps the idea that the new settlement that emerged was a partial restoration of the old makes a certain sense there. The power of finance capital is restored, as is ruling class authority more generally. It's not a situation in which it's a revolutionary transition. Whereas Gramsci himself, he's writing about the idea of the interregnum in the 1930s, right? It's the context is the high drama of the rise of fascism and the Stalinist Thermidor. That eventual development of the post-war settlement, it's highly contingent. It emerges from the really sort of colossal political and human disaster of the Second World War, and the sort of supranational institutions that emerge. They're very different, vastly more powerful than those of the interwar period. If a process as dramatic and extreme as that fits within the scheme of interregnum followed by hegemony, couldn't the same be true for our current moment? Or do you think, because the form of hegemony that followed the Second World War was so different from the preceding one, that it just stretches the idea of a stable situation followed by the chaos of interregnum followed by a stable situation? It just stretches that concept to breaking point, because you're comparing apples with oranges, as it were.
Well, I think there is definitely a risk of that kind of comparison of different things, but I wouldn't say it's politically impossible. What I'd argue is that there is a material transformation that's taken place, certainly within US empire, but not only, and I think actually also relates to forms of capitalism that have arisen in East Asia, for example. That would suggest to me that it becomes much more difficult to maintain the same kinds of class domination through at least the same mechanisms of control, political control, that existed in the 20th century. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be new mechanisms invented to establish class domination. I'm sure there will. There are new mechanisms which we can see emerging in the US itself as attempts to do so, but I don't think they're yet successful. But the main material transformations that I would point to here are related to the world of work and the ways in which consent is generated through the labor relation, and the precarious informalization of work over the last 50 years, starting on the periphery, but then increasingly in the core economies of the world system, has generated a need for new forms of coercion, even violence, to maintain the legitimacy of class domination. That isn't something that's restricted to the West. That's something that we see now increasingly in the US, in European countries, the ways in which violence substitutes labor as a means of social mediation. But it's also the case in China. The way in which the gig economy has expanded rapidly in China also creates a need for different kinds of coercive force. And so I would say it also becomes more difficult to envisage simple modern means of establishing hegemony through class domination in the ways in which it could be talked about. Obviously, the Thermidor to which you referred, it involved a significant degree of coercion too. But what I'm saying here is that the mechanisms, at least within a sort of modern capitalist society, that have been understood as serving to produce consent, seem to have been broken down. This is part of a broader sort of cannibalistic process of vanguard factions of capital cutting off their own arms, so to speak, or killing living labor, essentially, living labor being the source of their value, but doing that in order to produce new ways of generating profit.
And so for you then, the concept of after order is really a very capacious one, right? It's not confined to geopolitics and the weakening of supranational institutions or even to the breakdown of democratic norms. It's about also, as you say, the increase in precarious working conditions, the rise of arbitrary and perhaps sort of competing authority in the sphere of internal policing, security, and migration policy, crucially as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here, the other concept that is very relevant to Alameda's After Order project. Sovereignty is very useful because it helps us connect what's going on within nation states to what's going on in the international world. And the analysis of international order as an analysis of the end of US hegemony and the new geopolitics as it connects to different modes of international political economy makes very little sense without looking at questions of social formation and the transformation of forms of social mediation in the world of work, etc. And I would definitely connect the collapse of US hegemony. In fact, we can get into talking about what I understand to be the sort of endogenous factors involved in that. But I'd connect it to the increasing self-destructiveness of US capitalism and the generation of a kind of genocidal impulse that I think has been generalized from US empire outwards. And that genocidal impulse emerges from the transformation of what Marxists have called surplus populations, those who are waiting in the wings of the formal economy to be mobilized, but who can put pressure to bring down wages, and who also can be mobilized in moments of need for the formal economy. The transformation of those surplus populations into what seem to be superfluous populations, those who not only can no longer be made instrumental to regimes of accumulation, but actually start to become a drag on those same regimes of accumulation. And this is a broader process, an international process that I think can be observed as part of a kind of peripherization of the world. This generation of superfluous populations, I would say, is something that started on the periphery. And it started with the massive demographic expansion of cities on the periphery, the ways in which urbanization led to the increase of precarious informalization of labor. And then in particular, after 1982, the debt crisis that really hit the periphery hardest, creating a new drive for neoliberal transformation with structural adjustment programs, and that generating a kind of precarity in informal labor that was creating a kind of marginality that in fact had been discussed in the 1970s by theorists, often Marxist theorists of dependency, which I think actually at that point, marginality was a bit of a myth. What we see into the 2000s, and certainly around the time of the financial crisis, is difficult with the massive expansion of the gig economy on the periphery, and then increasingly in the core economies, is a way in which there is a difficulty of integrating people without new mechanisms of social protection, given that capital itself has difficulties in reproducing labor without the social protection of the state, and the social protection mechanisms, be those cash handouts, etc., increased pensions or even increased wages, etc., regulated by the state, also no longer seem to be feasible or viable under austerity regimes. What is it that's able to reproduce labor? Well, it's only the transformation of workers into entrepreneurs of the self, and the total deregulation of all the mechanisms that would enable them to have dignity in the workplace and rights and all the sort of modern premises of a sort of welfare state. In that situation, you have people who are engaged in an increasingly intense war for work. And it's a war for work that, because the labor capital relation is changing with the precarious informalization of work, is increasingly mediated by violence. What happens in that situation is you have, and I think this is actually central to the rise of a kind of defensive nationalism, often ethno-nationalism in European or Western countries in general, but also a kind of chauvinism on the periphery that is about creating boundaries to and constraining the war for work. It's also then, I think, most brutally and brazenly reflected in the genocide in Gaza. And there are obviously many factors that play into the genocide in Gaza: geopolitical, ethno-religious, political, personalistic of Netanyahu and his attempt to escape legal justice, all the rest of it. But there's certainly a factor that relates to the transformation of labor regimes in Israel.
This is because over time, Israel starts to simply dispense with Palestinian labor, right? And they
Right.
increasingly come to depend on labor from other parts of Asia, which are not, populations who don't present the same sort of political problem to Israel that the Palestinians obviously do.
Precisely. And it's interesting that this coincides with the neoliberal transformation of the Israeli economy, a moment also in which, maybe just after which the PLO had conceded to the idea of two states rather than pursuing one, which would also be related to the ways in which Palestinian laborers could be mobilized by the Israeli neoliberal regime, but that cheaper labor could be imported from elsewhere. So domestic workers from the Philippines, laborers from Eastern Europe as well as Asia, building workers from South Asia. That has resulted in a population in Gaza in particular that is decreasingly instrumental to the Israeli regime of accumulation. And if you have a population that's transformed into a superfluous population, the systemic response to that is to excise it. And you do that through extermination, expulsion. And I think that's a clear indication of the kind of impulse that is now central to a destructive or self-destructive regime of US-led capitalism.
Although the scale and the dynamics are very different and there are very different political contexts, but you would see the targeting of what is seen as a superfluous population in Gaza as not totally removed from murderously violent police regimes that have existed in parts of the global south, including where you are in Brazil, where certain populations are, because they are effectively seen as superfluous, are marked down for a kind of social cleansing.
Yeah, I think that's correct. When Gustavo Petro talked about Palestine being the laboratory for a new destructive phase of capitalism, I'm not sure he was referring exactly to the same tendency that I'm identifying here. But certainly, you can see the way in which there is a Palestinianization or even Gazification of the world that is occurring, and this genocide has been carried out simultaneous to processes on the periphery that are destructive of superfluous populations. Now, I would differentiate those slightly to some of the violent counter-revolutions that occurred in the, let's say, preventive counter-revolutions that occurred in the Cold War period, sort of anti-communist witch hunts from Indonesia to Latin America that resulted in massive extermination of, in inverted commas, subversive populations. I'm a product of auto-exile from Latin American dictatorships as a result of that period. And there was certainly an ideological and political element that is very different to what's going on today. What's happening today with the transformation of the world of work and the collapse, let's take Brazil as an example, something I've written on a bit, the way in which sovereignty is distributed in order to reproduce state power in Brazil. The transformation of the world of work has changed the way in which consent is generated in a country in which there was never a fully functioning modern state in the way that it was sort of idealized by European theorists, and that the state, with its reduced capacities through neoliberal transformation, has increasingly subcontracted many of its core functions, not just law preserving and law making. Some of those it has also subcontracted to sort of third sector actors, but even its core function of maintaining a monopoly on the use of legitimate violence, it subcontracts to a parastate, and a parastate that then goes into direct conflict with drug factions. But in fact, the drug factions also function to some extent as part of the same parastate, because that very violence, although it often sets the state against so-called non-state actors, it's creating a form of mediation of society and pacification of society that functions to reproduce state power. And that is necessary when you have populations who cannot any longer be integrated into a regime of accumulation, And if they can't be reintegrated, they start to become a risk to political stability, that is, right? Because they can themselves be mobilized through other means.
There's a tremendous amount of discussion, some of it perhaps exaggerated, around the threat of AI and automation. And, perhaps it could be the case that certain populations more than other intuit the threat of automation and AI as actually being more dramatic than we tend to think of it. We tend to think of it as just, it's more people on the unemployment rolls, right? Whereas, particularly if you're already a member of a more sort of marginalized population, the danger may turn out to be a lot greater than that, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think there is something that is apparent, if not tangible, in the way in which the development of AI, with the explicit intention on the part of AI pioneers to take humans out of the loop. They talk about closing the loop. What does it mean to take the human out of the loop? And which are the humans who are going to be taken out of the loop? Well, quite literally, that you no longer require people to perform the functions that they've previously performed in order to reproduce society and reproduce political power even. And if that's the case, then for what do people at the bottom end of social hierarchies, what purpose do they serve systemically? And that is what people feel when they're being asked to go out and become entrepreneurs, and they're having to hustle to survive in competition, direct competition with other people who are being asked to do the same thing. But that becomes almost a war to stay in the loop.
With the ongoing fracturing of US hegemony, the rise of China, and also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a tremendous amount of talk about moving into a world of spheres of influence, sometimes with the corollary that the Western Hemisphere will become the US sphere, although the war in Iran seems to have killed the idea of a retreat to the Western Hemisphere for the time being. In an article you wrote for Jacobin, you wrote that the world after order is giving form to a zonal geopolitics in which different terms of great power dispute will likely prevail across different geographic zones. This is a more unstable and dangerous inter-imperial arrangement, and it has significant implications for international governance and cooperation. Can you explain why you think zonal politics is a better way to think about our situation than spheres of influence, a term that connotes the inter-imperial rivalry of the interwar years?
Spheres of influence is a term that's used in more specific ways, in more open, generic ways. And I would say that if it's just a way of talking about attempts by great powers to dominate their respective regions, then it's not irrelevant to what's going on. But more specifically, it is a term that emerged at the back end of the 19th century, I believe, as a consequence of agreement between the British Empire and Germany in the 1880s to establish how they would divide up the control of different sites of imperial administration in the Gulf of Guinea and then in East Africa. And the idea that there would be no non-interference was central to that. So we will take this zone and you will take that zone, and we won't interfere in each other's business. It seems to me very clear that that is not applicable to the world in which we're in now. If you look at potential great powers and actual great powers, or even if we're just to take US, China, Russia, perhaps in military terms, there's no way that there's any kind of non-interference pact that's going to be established between those powers. And certainly China will continue to develop its relations with Latin American states and will try to ensure that there is yuan settlement of different kinds of trade with Latin America. Will establish swap lines with Latin American countries. The US will continue to de-risk many of its activities in Chinese areas of greater influence, and it will continue to conduct activities in the South China Sea and to provoke in the way that it does. But it's a different thing to start with on spheres of influence. It's a different thing that's going on now to what was going on when that term was used, and certainly in the interwar period to which you were referring as well.
And would you say that the tendency to reach for that term, do you think it betrays this kind of tendency that I think we all have to varying degrees, and that is very hard to get out of, to sort of think by analogy, right? To always want to find the historical precedent, and the most obvious case is the constant harking back to the 1930s, even if perhaps we do see a little bit less of that than we used to.
There's been a lot of discussion about historical analogy in particular in relation to the question of what is Trumpism the name. Is it fascism, or is it something else? And the way in which historians have become, in particular sort of liberal historians, have become prominent public intellectuals through the use of analogy, often as a part of a kind of liberal resistance politics, has obviously made those who are adverse to that tendency shy away from using analogy without caution. But there is no history writing without drawing comparisons. And I'm not sort of somebody who would stick to a very strict conceptualist view on things. I would just say that in this case, if we're going to be specific about what is going on, that term in its legalistic meaning has a central implication that isn't relevant. In a generic mobilization of the term, sure, you can see elements of its relevance,
but not when it comes to this idea of non-interference, right?
Yeah, non-interference over distant dominions or distant colonies, or that's central to the idea of spheres of influence. Going to the idea of, or the notion of a zonal geopolitics, I mean, that's also quite a broad concept. And what I mean by that, quite simply, is the way in which there will continue to be attempts by great powers to engage in self-interested activities in different parts of the world, but that the terms of that engagement in different zones, and that will depend not just on contestation by other great powers, but will also depend on the configuration of activities by their respective capitals and by host states of their corporations. Well, those terms will be set much more regionally than I think we've seen in a world under US hegemony, which also then has implications for international cooperation and those who are, even in sort of more conventional liberal terms, trying to build a multilateral system for peace and cooperation and some kind of order. If the UN is to some extent a product of US hegemony, and what I mean by that isn't that the UN was always just the result of top-down impositions by US empire, but that the same system of consent that sustained US hegemony with its material basis in American capitalism is also the system of consent that enabled a multilateral system of the UN to continue to function in the way it did. And if we're moving into a new kind of geopolitics in which those terms are defined in much more regionalized forms, multilateralism will necessarily need to take a different form if it's going to have any relevance at all in international affairs. There are, of course, adaptations already to this new geopolitics that have been made over the last 20 years or so. The rise of bloc kind of politics, particularly in the global south, I think that will continue to be of great relevance to attempts to build minimal forms of cooperative power to resist the impositions of imperial states.
You're very skeptical of the idea that China could assume the role of a new global hegemon replacing the United States. Can you explain why you think China is unlikely to be able to play such a role? And would it be right to think that primarily you see that again in terms of material factors, that China, in spite of its economic rise and its dominance in many new technologies, is not about to develop the kind of economic power that would allow that kind of hegemonic imperial expansion.
Most people who are somewhat or slightly skeptical of the possibility of global hegemony under China would point to a normative disposition, maybe even an ideological one, against hegemony. And so that can be read starting in the middle of the 20th century from the way in which China was very prominent in opposing, from Bandung onwards, opposing imperial and hegemonic regimes, at least in sort of rhetoric and organization of other third world states in particular. The fact that
and that's both the United States and the Soviet Union, right, which China comes to see as an imperial power following the Sino-Soviet split.
Well, Mao's three worlds put the US and USSR in the first world, with other developed countries in the second world, and then developing countries, including China, in the third. But then more recently, Chinese theorists of global power and strategists have talked about a regime after hegemony. I think the most prominent example, not at least insofar as it's reached the West, and I believe the book Unrestricted Warfare, which is by Qiao Liang and Wang Xiangsui. But this book on Unrestricted Warfare discussed the ways in which, because of the rise of technology, the world was becoming more fragmented, such that hegemony would no longer be possible. I wouldn't take all those statements and those rhetorical positions of Chinese leaders, including, in fact, Xi Jinping, whose thought also tends to present an opposition to a global hegemonic regime. I wouldn't take those as the definitive statement on whether or not it's possible that there would be Chinese hegemony. I would tend to look at the material circumstances of the Chinese economy, the way in which it's engaging as Jingguan Li calls it, global China, and starting with the internal conditions of the Chinese economy. I think, of course, China continues to be a rising and rapidly rising power. Now, in terms of GDP on PPP, China is the world's biggest economy, but it's also showing certain signs of malaise, maybe even some of the kind of pathologies that we see in the US economy when people refer to secular stagnation, the ways in which there's a slowing of productivity and demand, and those themselves being indicative perhaps of a secular stagnation that's exacerbated by industrial overcapacity and by rising debt and an aging population. And the great challenge, of course, that is to continue to grow a mass consumer base in China while maintaining low wages, such that China continues to have competitive advantage in the areas that is exercised over the last couple of decades, in manufacturing, not least. I would be much more cautious when talking about military questions or even ideology. So, for example, people often say China doesn't exercise military force in the way that Western powers do. It has no interest in policing the world. Fine, it doesn't now. And there's nothing to say that it couldn't or wouldn't in 20 years' time. Obviously, there are different philosophical bases for the generation of an ideological disposition of government, etc. But if you look at the US in its own rise, it wasn't an interventionist power early on. Of course, there were specific interventions that were key to its rise, but it wasn't the kind of military interventionist power that it became once it developed its military-industrial complex that it needed to sustain in order also to reproduce the power of that sector and do so in a way that would be beneficial to US state power.
Mm. And also was so, Julian, I mean, also the United States was in the early 20th century at the point where it could have created a military industrial base that was more powerful than anything that existed on the European continent. but didn't do so until later, right? Didn't really, achieve that until the Second World War.
Exactly, and that was the key turning point. And I think all the discussion of grand ideological dispute of the Cold War often overlooks the way in which that grand ideological dispute was a necessary corollary of the expansion of the military industrial base of the United States. Well, but then also an ideological factors is Chinese society, without even thinking of the CCP and Chinese government, is Chinese society disposed to some kind of hegemonic rule, the generation of a consent for Chinese global power. And on the one hand, if you could look to ideas of harmony in Chinese Confucian philosophy, etc., and say, oh no, maybe that's not quite the same as the autonomous drive of the Western individual, modern individual, and therefore there's a sort of less competitive edge. And there are all sorts of arguments that are made and can be made in that direction. But it's also clear that China does have a project of normative expansion, let's say, and also of epistemic expansion, the way in which it has been conducting itself within international institutions, the way it's been re-signifying certain institutions of the UN, trying to change voting systems in the IMF, the way in which it's promoting the possibility of other currencies being used in the IMF for different kinds of credit. And then it's heavy investment in knowledge production in universities all around the world.
But that could be interpreted as part of a project of building multipolarity, right? It might lead to a privileged position for China, say, in Asia, but it's not necessarily the case that one has to interpret that as a bid for hegemony, right?
No, exactly. Well, that's what I'd say. My next point was going to be that I would exercise a degree of caution in respect to its military power and its ideological disposition to hegemony. I think there's still a lot to be seen with respect to how it conducts itself with the global South, in inverted commas. It's clear that it's happy being primus inter pares there, and the BRICS is a good example of that. The expansion of the BRICS, as much as it's been championed by other states, including Brazil, certainly benefits China primarily. But I think that the big factor here at play, going back to a sort of a global question, is one that we yet haven't discussed, but relates to the way in which power can be reproduced and systems of consent can be reproduced within states and then external to them in our current period, is climate change, and the way in which that has a huge impact on supply chains, on governance, on the management of populations, the biological management of populations, and the way in which it generates not least new forms of interaction with nature that themselves are destructive. That is one of the key factors that I'd say that is accelerating the more destructive tendencies of US capitalism, but it also is already serving as a clear challenge to the rise of China. Even if China is delinking itself from the energy matrix that was one of the foundations of US hegemony, sort of fossil fuel matrix and petrochemicals. The Chinese drive to be the leading power in renewable energy also is being shaped continuously by the challenges of climate change and ecological collapse as it's already happened.
Yeah, it doesn't insulate them from economic shocks and the inflation that goes along with it, right? Yeah.
I'd say one final question that's maybe one of time rather than one of permanent necessity, and that is, I mentioned previously one indicator of US hegemony being the way in which there's an adherence to the dollar as the global reserve currency, as the dominant world currency. But it's not currently in Chinese interests to try to fully contest dollar dominance. most transactions, the Belt and Road Initiative, are conducted in dollar. Chinese elites hold dollar assets, and an entire international system of credit creation that also maintains many of China's allies within a relative consent to Chinese relative power is to do with their dependence still on the dollar. And it doesn't seem to me that China is yet willing to try and fully contest that, even if it's obviously making moves towards a greater diversification of the international monetary system.
Yeah, something obviously very much supported by the various targets of US sanctions. Finally, you mentioned to me that you're currently working on an essay on what you describe as the viability of humanism in a time of catastrophe, and how, after order, our collective imagination is dominated by dystopian images of catastrophe, for which the counterpoint seems to be claims to sovereignty. Could you say a bit more about what you're working on in that essay, and also in particular around that question of sovereignty, which tends to be very much often seen solely in the negative context of various forms of ethno-nationalism and so on?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about and write about the relationship between imagination, ideology, and politics over the last few years. In particular, and it's actually kind of central to the proposition of Alameda as well, in which we discuss the idea that we're in a time of catastrophe. And that's largely because there's been a hell of a lot of discussion of the end of things over many decades now. The apotheosis of endism was perhaps Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history, but in a sense that came quite late, at least in relation to the material processes that probably generated an idea that things that had been hoped for, expectations, modern expectations, were coming to an end of some kind of transcendence of the society that existed under capitalism, at least. And after certainly a neoliberal period in which some kind of realism, capitalist realism, existed, in which it was thought that there was not only no alternative, but certainly no future, that there was a permanent presentism. There seems to have emerged over the last 15 years a new concept of the future that dominates collective imagination, at least within capitalist democracies. Except that vision, those images of the future, have no bearing, no relation to kind of a utopian transformation. In fact, if we look to our art and our film, literature, and theory, we see everywhere catastrophe. And that catastrophe is often in the form of ecological collapse, but also in the form of great power warfare and nuclear annihilation, or just a more banal disintegration of the modern work society with rights and benefits.
I suppose some certain forms of antinatalism as well. The sort of
as well.
Why have children?
Right.
Kind of
right.
And it's both financially increasingly impossible, but also what's the point? I think that's part of the attitude.
Which also finds some at some point a kind of weird connection with transhumanism. Why reproduce if we can also just extend the life of those who matter? There's this connection between the antinatalism that is on the rise within society with the transhumanism, particularly of sort of tech lords, and a new eugenics that's being spread not just amongst those kind of ideologues, but also within the social sciences. But yeah, going back, this is obviously not the first time that people have discovered that the world might end, or have thought the world might end, and that there has been a collective imagination of the end of the world. In fact, this is an almost essentially modern trope, certainly a Renaissance trope, and the idea of the last man that was very prominent in romantic literature and art at the beginning of the 19th century, the turn and the beginning of the 19th century, demonstrates that there have often been moments of apocalyptic fear and threat, But those have often been generated in modern history. Those have often been generated, including in fin de siècle, the turn of the 20th century. Those have often been generated alongside utopian visions in moments of instability, even actually in moments of interregnum, actual interregnum. And so this instability has often caused a kind of interplay between hope and desperation that has generated images through art in particular of a no place, the utopia that could be a better place, and dystopia, so the end of things.
I suppose Rosa Luxemburg and socialism or barbarism slogan in the context of the First World War is a very obvious example.
Absolutely, the great catastrophe of the First World War, generating many images and those dichotomies that could potentially play out one way or the other. What we see now is a series of these dystopian images of catastrophe, and rather than having at the same time the generation of a utopian imagination, we do get people wanting to reimagine something better. And in fact, there's been no shortage of exercises in reimagining things throughout the neoliberal period. Everyone's, in particular, sort of think tanks, policy think tanks have spent their time reimagining the state, reimagining society, reimagining markets, etc. But those exercises of reimagination are almost entirely disconnected from material transformations. And the counterpoint that is produced by the material reality of today seems to be a defensive claim for sovereignty, which is a desire to hold on minimally to some kind of control with what seems to be a runaway process, a runaway trend towards catastrophe. And in that moment in which the only thing that seems to be claimed is some degree of defensive control, the possibility of human agency seems to wane. And it wanes not just because of the material transformations that have generated precarious informality in the workplace, that have produced superfluous populations, but also because humans are being taken out of the loop, and AI seems to threaten some kind of human essence, even as tech lords talk about transcending the possibilities of the human body. The idea of an essential transcendence of the human seems to disappear. And I would say fundamentally as well by climate change and the way in which climate change challenges modern assumptions, at least modern Eurocentric assumptions of the autonomy of the individual and its subordination of nature to its own needs. At the same time, I think climate change offers us an interesting example of paradox that's at play, because the transformations of the latter part of the 20th century and the early 20th century seem to imply that the human as some kind of ideal is no longer viable. And yet, on the one hand, looking back into the 20th century, many of the expectations that emerged from sort of more economically deterministic visions of and teleological visions of a future were undone by the development of capitalism itself. So all the expectations of an imminent transcendence of the system undoing itself were proven not to be correct. And if they ever were correct, they no longer became viable towards the end of the 20th century. And so many of the gains that we can look back at in terms of democratic participation, minimal gains in terms of political rights and civil rights, they seem to be increasingly a response or a representation of the human interhuman need to mobilize and of human agency in some way. And looking at climate change, as we think about what the possibilities of averting the worst of climate change today, it's only through some kind of human agency, including the exercise of some kind of human will, that seems possible. Climate change, I think, has provided the most fundamental challenge to the philosophical foundations of the materialist left and I consider myself to be part of that grouping. That is, if you take quite crudely a distinction between the eco-modernists on the one hand and the degrowthers on the other, they're both forced into idealistic positioning and posturing. The eco-modernists, in order for there to be some kind of technological advancement sufficient in order to divert from the catastrophes of climate change and ecological collapse, would need technological leaps of a kind that we haven't seen in modern history. Therefore, there is a force of will that needs to be exercised in order to imagine that possibility that there could be the great Promethean progress. On the other hand, the degrowthers, again, I'm sort of throwing people into quite crudely into two categories here, necessarily depend on a certain kind of austerity, if not frugality, a rational control of abundance at best, if not a more widespread control of consumption that itself will depend on not just individual will, but the mass organization of the exercise of will and constraint. And so in that context, not only do we look backwards and see the human as an agent that had some kind of role within material process in bringing about minimal positive changes in modern times, but also the only possibility there seems to be of diverting from the great catastrophic threats that now dominate our collective horizon is through mobilizing human agency to do something different.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poltheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.